the hangar, there is a red 4-1 printed on the southern wall of each of these hangar bays. That's important. And also, these hangars have a track system where you can pull these disc-shaped craft out on a rolling track. That's important as well. Now, the next hangar bay, which is 6, this was described as a, quote, F-22 configuration, which is a man-made version of what is in hangar bay 3 of the P-24 Roswell craft. So what I'm saying here is, and this doesn't come from me, this comes from Phil Schneider and Dan Burisch personally, is, and I know it sounds crazy, but what Dan is saying is that the F-22 is configured after the P-24 Roswell craft.
Right.
The exterior configuration of the F-22 was derived from the Roswell craft. Now, I know we're going to get a lot of, negative comments on that, but this is what Dan Burisch told me personally.
Yep.
And he even drew me a very rough diagram of what he meant. What he did is he took the F-22 top view, and then he said, "Do you remember in grade school and even earlier the old connect the dots game where you would draw a spline curve around the circumference of an aircraft?" That's exactly what is happening with what they've done. Is they've patterned the F-22 after what was in Hangar Bay 3. It sounds incredible, but that comes from Dan Burisch.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of the eyewitness accounts of the crescent-shaped craft that crashed there in Roswell. Yeah, I can see that.
Right. The next Hangar Bay, we don't know because it was covered by a tarp. We don't know exactly what that was. Hangar Bay 8, according to Dan Burisch, is the only alien vehicle at S4 at the time. It was a black isosceles triangular. It was called the licorice drop, quote, the licorice drop, and he said that it was kind of a glistening black type craft, and then he said that you could look into eternity in this vehicle. Now, that's a very hard description to actually pin down, but for some reason, this particular vehicle, when you saw it, it was like you were looking into eternity. It was a very strange textured vehicle. Very hard to describe.
Is it just me, or when you look at this craft, does it remind you of the Rendlesham incident?
Perhaps.
Yeah,
perhaps.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there could be a connection there, but that's what Dan Burisch said, that it's just a very fascinating craft, and he said that out of all the craft that were there, that was the only one that was alien. Hangar 9 was completely empty, so we don't know if there was anything there.
Incredible.
So basically, what Dan Burisch is saying here is that, and there's a big thing that we need to cover as well, is there's a difference between extraterrestrials and aliens. That's a whole thing that needs to be covered. Basically, when you talk about an extraterrestrial is someone who shares our own human DNA genetic makeup. In essence, they are us. So when you say a P-45 J-Rod craft, you're talking about a future human who has come back in time from 45,000 years from our future to our time. That's what the term P-45 J-Rod craft means. When you talk about an alien is a completely different species that does not have human DNA. That's the differentiation between the two.
Yeah, this is where the story gets real juicy. I like it from here on out. Are you going to segue?
Sure.
Are you going to segue into the Hangar 4 craft at this point?
The Hangar 4 craft is the P-52 Orion craft.
Right.
According to Dan, all of this got started with the crash retrieval that took place at Kingman, Arizona. They brought that craft to Area S4, and that's how this whole thing began. The J-Rod came from the Kingman UFO crash. That's the origin point of all of this, according to Dan Burisch.
Okay. Now, from here, we've got a rundown of the facility, the hangars, the craft that were in there. Let's talk about J-Rod. What the heck happened here? Where is he from?
Okay. J-Rod is from our future. He is from our future, and he was suffering from a genetic defect or a neuropathy defect, and his species was dying because something happened in our time that changed our DNA, and when we evolved 45,000 years into the future, we became the J-Rod. So the reason why J-Rod came back to our time is that in hopes that they could find a solution or cure for the neuropathy so that when we would evolve 45,000 years into our future, we would not have that same defect. That's the whole reason, in a nutshell, why J-Rod came back here. That's the reason why he was here.
Right. Now, maybe I'm jumping the gun here, Michael, but that according to Dan Burisch, this time-traveling paradox and these extraterrestrials actually being us from the future is the reason why a lot of this is being kept secret, according to Burisch. Am I right?
Reason what? Well, that's one reason. He did talk about the doctrine of convergent timeline paradox, and I drew the parallel of Back to the Future Part 2, which I felt is exactly right on here.
Yeah.
We are on, quote, timeline 1, okay? But if you use a looking glass device that was on level 4-2 of Area S4, if you use that device and you physically act on anything you've seen, touched, smelled, heard, or felt, or anything, if you physically act on that, you are now no longer on timeline 1, you are now on timeline 2, because you've acted upon something that you've seen in the future. So we're now on timeline 2, and that's exactly what perhaps is happening with these looking glass devices, and they know the danger of doing that. When you act on these things, you can alter our timeline. And so, according to Dan Burisch, these devices were dismantled because it's very dangerous to play with time like that.
Yep, and for all you guys out in Radio Land, these looking glass devices are basically machines developed to look into our future or possible futures.
That is correct.
It's another very interesting part of the story.
Essentially, that is correct, yes. They can be used for that. One other thing we should keep in mind, too, is Dan Burisch, now he is saying this, in 1954, this goes back in ufology here, we've all heard about this, that Eisenhower met with extraterrestrials at Edwards Air Force Base in 1954, and there was an agreement, a treaty was signed, and something was given to President Eisenhower called the Orion Cube.
Yeah.
Now, Dan wouldn't exactly tell me where it is now, but at one time it's believed that it was at S4 and also at the Scottish Rite Masonic Lodge near Washington, D.C. It was kept there as well. I don't know where it is now, but this had the technology to also see the probability of future events as well. And so it's called the Orion Cube. It was about 8 inches by 8 inch square, and it projected an image about 10 inches above the cube itself. Just incredible technology that was allegedly given to President Eisenhower back in 1954.
It's these Project Looking Glass devices almost seem like a more evolved form of future predictability machine, in that the Orion Cube, Dan Burisch says, could be influenced by the viewer, where the Looking Glass device, there was no effect on the viewer. The possibilities just came out.
Well, when you have the Looking Glass device, keep in mind that this is level 4-2, and all of this is being recorded so that, on high definition videotape. When they fired up these devices, everything was documented with videotape cameras and for future reference. And a lot of this information and the, quote, training update tapes that Dan Burisch talked about were stored in the briefing room on level 4-1. So if there's anywhere we could ever go to prove any of this story, and I'm talking, the real evidence,
yeah,
you would need to go to the, quote, briefing room on 4-1 where they keep these tapes, and the files are there as well.
Yeah.
So that's the place that would be the most beneficial to confirm this story, because that's where they have the tapes of all this.
Yep, this is an incredible story. We've got S4, we've got this incredible technology of aerial craft, some extraterrestrial, one possibly alien. We've got essentially time-traveling devices where you don't actually go through time, but you're witnessing future time events. And now we got this interaction with J-Rod, the extraterrestrial. He is from, you tell us where he's from, Zeta Reticuli?
He comes from the Orion constellation.
Right. And then also what I want to get to...
Zeta, yeah.
Right, is this catastrophic event that turns us humans into the J-Rod extraterrestrial. Maybe you can describe what that extraterrestrial looked like according to Burisch and what that catastrophe was.
Well, upon first seeing the J-Rod, Dan said that he thought it was a large insect. I mean, of all things. It was scrunched down in the corner. They refused to give the J-Rod clothing. They called him Stumpy. They called him names. He was kept in something called the clean sphere, which is another fascinating device, on level 4-5. And any time that the J-Rod did not follow the instructions of some of the MJ-12 members who were looking down on the J-Rod through this viewing glass section of 4-5, they would change the pressure of this facility, which would negatively affect the J-Rod. And so it was a real captive type situation here. And what he said is he was a small, 3.5 to 4 feet tall, small, looked like an insect. He had a large knuckle or bone near the end of his leg. He had rough skin, no teeth, no hair, large eyes. He could walk, but it was very labor-intensive for him to walk. So, in a nutshell, that's sort of what he looked like.
I just have to ask you, Michael, because when I was reading this Project Aquarius document, I noticed in the black and white drawings, the texture of the skin almost seems scaly, and then in the colored versions, it seems a little bit smoother, almost like two different entities. But
it's impossible to get it exactly correct, but generally, that's a relatively good estimation as to what J-Rod actually looked like.
Michael, do you have a couple more minutes here? Are we pushing your time here?
No, go right ahead.
Okay.
I've got all the time. All the time.
This is what I love about...
We also need to cover what was also in level 4-2, because, we very briefly went through 4-1, but there's some things in 4-2 as well.
Can we talk about that right after we mention the information that was relayed from the extraterrestrial J-Rod to Burisch about the catastrophe?
Yeah, that's something that Dan will not discuss completely in detail. Now, he has 3-ring binders full of notes that were downloaded to Dan, so I am not privy to that information, and I don't think Dan is comfortable releasing that into the public domain, but from what I gather, there was some type of catastrophe in our timeline that caused this DNA effect. I don't know if this is the main event or a secondary event. Now, Dan has recently revised some of this, and that we have now gone beyond that time frame. We have avoided this catastrophe. However, they were in that condition, so something must have happened. So I am not privy to what that download was, but there was a download between the J-Rod and Dan Burisch on level 4-5, and there were some very interesting things that were transferred over.
So are you insinuating that the catastrophe was averted?
I don't know how the catastrophe could have been averted because they have the defect, so something must have happened. Okay. Something must have actually taken place which caused their DNA to start breaking down. And I don't know if we have avoided it, because if you look, that's what we are apparently going to evolve into. So I don't know if we have averted the catastrophe. If we have, then they would have no reason to come back here to find a cure. That's my reasoning.
Okay, Michael, maybe we'll talk about that other level of S4 and then come back to talk about the finale, about what happened with J-Rod, Dan Burisch, and a Stargate, and how Sumer fits into the picture. Sure.
I love this part. This is interesting, and this is kind of the end game to all this. What happened to J-Rod, right? Well, right around 2003, Dan did go to Abydos in Egypt, and they brought J-Rod there in what they called the buggy. Okay, so this is kind of like a miniature clean sphere, and there were armed military guard around this whole facility. And you have to remember that J-Rod and Dan, they developed a personal relationship. And, they couldn't talk via speaking word, but they could